morning to those of you joining us from the Americas, and afternoon for Europe and Africa, and a very late good evening for Asia, and I guess it's early morning in Australia. The focus of this presentation is on how to be successful leading an offshore team, and I specifically chose offshore versus global because I wanted to talk about the connection points when you're either starting to build a global operation or even after you've been doing it for a while, to kind of highlight some of the learnings we've had in working with customers and doing this ourselves. What's interesting is looking at Gartner every year when they publish their report of leading locations, and they always publish the top 30, and it's been fairly stable, probably the last 5 or 6 years. What surprised me this year is how much change, and a lot of their focus is starting to look at emerging markets and emerging companies or countries that are doing this. But I was surprised by how many developed countries that kind of moved off the list. The important part, I think, that the takeaway for us is that everybody, because the infrastructure is getting better, I think because we've been doing more global operations for many years now, there's a lot of learnings that every country has started to build into their infrastructure, into their education, and obviously their focus from an IT perspective has helped all of us have more options as we grow our companies, especially as we start to work in the emerging markets. We have more options on the type of work that we can get done. And for CAI, we have 4 really what we kind of call our hubs, and that is in the Philippines, in China, which is where most of my background is, but I've worked in the Philippines as well, India, and most recently, a couple years ago, Argentina. When looking at an offshore location, a lot of times people, and I know in talking to some Gartner analysts, one of the problems is people sometimes pick a country and want to do business there because they understand it's the best country to go to. And really what you need to start with is, what is the strategy? Is the strategy that part of our work will go offshore, and it's really a labor arbitrage play because we want to extend our current organization, but we don't have the funding to add 20 people in the U.S., but we do have funding to add 20 people in China? Or is the strategy to follow your markets? A lot of global companies, and actually a lot of companies that are becoming global, are starting to work in country in areas they have no experience. I've worked actually recently with a financial services company that wants to do more business in China. And part of their strategy then is to extend their IT organization into China so they can get on-the-ground experience working with Chinese culture. And I think that's a very strong strategy because it allows you, especially leveraging a firm like us, it allows you to work within a country and get feedback and help and support from people that have been working in country for a while. It gives you much more of a structure to mitigate the risk of starting to work in different countries. And internally to your own organization, it is important to communicate what is that strategy. Why? Because we're dealing with human beings that want to understand, why are you doing things differently tomorrow than you've done in the past? What is the reason for that? And ultimately, how can I help? Once you communicate broadly your offshore strategy, your first thought should be, okay, now I need to connect to that office, to that building, to that location in a way that protects whatever we're going to do. On the one hand, you've got your internal security policies, understanding how you classify your current IP and how that will change, possibly with the different laws in different countries. You clearly want to implement technologies, and there are a lot today. I look back just over the past 5 years how sophisticated technologies have become in protecting what you have, but also how sophisticated people have become in trying to get into networks. And the important part of that is, okay, depending on what you're building offshore or off-country, what other ideas or what other practices can we put in place to further protect critical data or knowledge? The most obvious, working with a company that was building a credit card application. Some of the simple things that you can do from a work practice is always obviously to mask data, don't use real data in your testing, but sometimes you've got to go live, and how to put practices within your approach that protects the most critical information. Another project that we worked with, we had a long discussion on the testing team and that there's a lot of IP in actually doing the testing. And what we ended up doing was putting more development offshore and more testing onshore. In their mind, the critical piece was not the software. The critical piece was actually the use of that software. And they could manage components offshore that protected the IP of the logic of the function, but that was much harder when you got into the testing environment. So what worked really well was they kept testing onshore, but they had to still build things offshore for local testing, so they weren't spending an inordinate amount of time doing bug fixes as they were going through the development project. And those are just two examples of thinking about your business, thinking about it, how it applies, and then understanding where is the risk that you're worried about, and there are fairly simple ways to protect that. And I think that's a piece that people either assume is easy, or worse, they assume it's not necessary. Once you understand your strategy and once you understand how you can physically set things up, then it is a question, and they're probably related, as to what type of work is best suited. Now, if you're a global company that's done this for a while and you're moving to another offshore location, or you're mitigating your risk by going to multiple countries, you probably will go through a different process because of the experience you have. But if you've never done this before, then you look at very easy candidates that are low risk to the business, maybe low IP, maybe very repeatable. Anything that you have that, and this is where I think a lot of the financial industry has outsourced a lot of business, is there are some common practices, there's some common architecture, there's some common I guess processes and software that is used, so you don't need as much business knowledge to get work done in multiple locations. Also looking for work that doesn't rely on too much back and forth with your home operation because of the time zone differences. So you're looking for things that are relatively independent, relatively low risk, relatively low interaction with users, become very good candidates. As you gain experience in country, you then obviously can get more complex in the way you do things, but the principles that I'm going to review today are still the same. You still need people that understand it is more complicated to do work outside of one office, and whether that office is across the street, whether the office is multiple floors. 80% of the learnings that I have by working in the Philippines and working in India and working in China, I can draw from a project that I ran 10 years ago between Philadelphia and Wilmington. The fascinating part is when humans are out of sight, everything gets more complicated because some of the assumptions we make when we can walk around go away. And you are more dependent on what's written down. You are more dependent on formal ways of communicating and don't realize how many informal ways there are. So when you start to figure out what projects make the most sense early, you're really trying to limit the complicating factors that have more to do with how humans work than how systems work. Once you know exactly what's going, this is, and from a consulting standpoint, this is the most critical risk mitigation. It is the transition plan of how do I help people in another environment